had to go for a walk for the last 45 minutes because I needed to know what happened, but that wasn't something... Chores weren't going to cut it. We had to go. Hi, I'm Jane Alice.
And I'm Hanna.
And we're booksellers at Rediscovered Books, and we want to tell you why Librofm and their audiobooks are so great. Number one, they're a small social purpose company based out of Seattle with a bunch of employees that are really, really passionate about what they do.
Yeah, they have such great customer service. If you have questions, they are so prompt and great about answering those questions and making sure you have a great experience, not only listening to the audiobooks that you decide to purchase, but also if you have questions and need help, they want to help.
On top of that, they work and partner with over 1,600 different bookstores across the US and Canada, splitting profits with them on memberships, audiobooks, and really anything that you purchase on Librofm, that's shared with bookstores.
Another really great thing about Libro is how they handle DRM rights. They are DRM rights free, which means once you purchase the audiobook, it is yours. And it's awesome because they have a really highly usable app that you can download on tablets or on your phone. Or if that is a little bit too high tech, you can also just download the files onto your computer and listen there as well. And it's just a super slick, simple, easy way to get your audiobook.
And in today's day and age, being able to listen on your terms on whatever device that you happen to own, that's kind of a big deal because not every audiobook service has that option.
Also, on their website, it is so handy that they have actual bookseller recommendations, bookseller developed playlists, but also on specific audiobook pages, if that has been reviewed by a bookseller at a store across the United States or Canada, that will show up. And so you can actually see what a more on-the-ground kind of person thinks about that book.
And if you pick a specific bookstore that you want your purchases or your membership to support, a lot of times it'll push any reviews from your booksellers that you want to support up to the front so you can see exactly what Hanna or Jane Alice or one of the Rebeccas here at Rediscovered Books has said about that book that you're contemplating whether or not you want to listen to. So with all of that in mind, one of the things we also want to talk about today is some of our favorite audiobooks that personally we think are better as an audiobook than maybe even reading as a physical book.
For me personally, I have been an audiobook lover since I was in elementary school, and so I'm not actually as picky as one might expect about what quality I'm looking for in a narrator, but there are certain narrators that I've literally picked up audiobooks just because they're the narrator. And this stems from them being the narrators of my all-time favorite audiobook, The Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater, and it is narrated by Stephen West and Fiona Hardingham. And they're just such talented narrators. They bring the atmospheric, ethereal beauty of Maggie Stiefvater's words to life. And they've got great voices. I could listen to them for days and I would never get bored.
Mm-hmm. Also, when I listened to that one, that was one of the small handful of audiobooks that I started looking for other chores to do because I didn't want to stop listening to it. And then I ran out of chores. And usually I can't just sit and listen to an audiobook, but that was one that was like, no, I have half an hour left. I have to know. I don't want to leave.
Yeah.
So good.
So
one of my all-time favorite books that I felt is really, really elevated by being an audiobook, especially with a fabulous narrator, is Watership Down. The recent edition was narrated by Peter Capaldi, and oh my god, it's so good. I already love that book and all of its characters, but he manages to capture, with entirely different voices for each character, almost like their motivations and feelings just with his inflection and narration and his accents, and it's just incredible. I've loved that book for years, and re-listening to it with his narration, I fell in love with it all over again.
Another book that I just finished listening to, and I actually powered through it in 2 days because it was blowing my mind, was How High We Go in the Dark. And it's been getting quite a bit of buzz. I've been seeing a lot of people talking about it, and I was just so curious, and I had a lot of crafts I was going to be doing over the weekend, so I just was like, okay, gonna pull that up, and it was phenomenal. Not only because it's a great story, but because it's done by a full cast narration. Each chapter is a different narrative character and therefore a different narrator, and it just brings the story alive. Having those accents, as Jane Alice mentioned, just really adds more of a spin that a physical book doesn't necessarily present you with, and it was just so beautiful and gorgeous, and I'm still thinking about it, frankly, and probably will re-listen to it in the next couple of months because it was mind-blowing.
Yeah, it's my next read as soon as I finish Jade Legacy. Another audiobook that I loved that honestly was really elevated simply by being an audiobook because it was a fabulous story. The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. It's narrated by Robin Miles, and between her expert narration and command of the characters and just like a little bit of atmospheric noise and sounds and like just a little bit of music at like key points, it almost felt like you're listening to a radio drama. It just made that experience that much more, and it was so cool to listen to.
Tagging on to the whole radio drama thing, not necessarily my personal favorite audiobook by any means, but having listened to a couple of the Star Wars novels as audiobooks, they're more like radio plays. There is typically music scored by John Williams, and also frequently extra sounds, and they're just really fun to listen to. So if you're a big Star Wars geek, like, definitely check out the audiobooks. They're worth it.
One of my favorite audiobooks that I listened to last year was Angeline Boulley's Firekeeper's Daughter. It's narrated by Isabella Starr LeBlanc, and while it's already a really phenomenal novel, her narration really brings home a lot of those characters and really just immersing you in that experience of being in that character's indigenous community and some of the history and stuff with that. And the way she does the inflections of how certain people speak and how they relate to each other, it just makes it feel that much more real. And while I still think I would have loved it if I had sat down and read the book, I can't get over how much I enjoyed that audiobook.
An audiobook I really enjoyed from last year is Almond by Won-pyung Sohn. It was narrated by Greg Chun, and it's a lit title, and I am not really big about reading lit books physically. I just get a little bored. It's just something about how my brain is wired. I can't sit down and just power through a lit book very often. But audiobooks allow me to read books that I potentially would miss, and Almond is definitely one of them. It is a very sparsely, poignantly written book about a young man who does not experience feelings like the average person because his amygdala is not developed. And the way it is written very much emphasizes the fact that he is not feeling anything, but you as the reader, or in this case listener, are feeling emotions. And it was just so well done. The narration pulls you into the story and definitely makes you feel while the main character isn't feeling. And I absolutely adored that story. But again, I don't think I probably would ever have picked up Almond and just read it. So I love that audiobooks allow you access to books you maybe wouldn't necessarily think to read because it's not your usual genre.
That's how I end up powering through a lot of nonfiction that I find really interesting, but probably wouldn't be able to read more than a chapter or two at a time. But when I'm listening to it, I'm able to go for a walk or drive to work or be working on a project, all while mulling that over in my mind and listening to the narration, which is how I've listened to some really, really cool nonfiction in the last year. And then kind of circling back to fiction books that almost feel like a radio drama, one in particular that's also kind of unique that we both really love is Sadie by Courtney Summers. It's
so good. It's narrated by a whole cast of characters because half of the book is a podcast. And so for the audiobook, it's basically a
like
full
listening
cast
to a
podcast.
Yeah.
And it's so cool. And then you have the other half of the book is Sadie, the narrative main character's point of view, and so then you have a separate narrator for that. And I have to say, I really loved it because Dan Bittner is another one of my favorite audiobook narrators, and he is the
fabulous job.
He represents the character that is running the podcast, so his voice is present
private
throughout
detective who's trying to help
so good.
track down Sadie, who's run away from home to try and find her sister and potentially find the person who may have kidnapped or killed her or whatever happened to her. If you love true crime, it's a brilliant book and kind of chilling. And the flipping back and forth between Sadie's perspective, where Sadie is telling her story of where she's gone since leaving home, and then flipping back to the private detective who's trying to piece it all together. The way it starts to come together and the threads start to piece together towards the end, I had to go for a walk for the last 45 minutes because I needed to know what happened, but that wasn't something... Chores weren't going to cut it. We had to go. We had to be moving.
Yeah.
It was so good.
Yeah, I think I've listened to the last, hour and a half of that audiobook. Just the last hour and a half so many times, just because even though I know what the story is, anytime I pick up that audiobook, I'm always just like,
it's so
I
satisfying.
can't believe this is how it goes.
Yeah.
Is this really how it goes? Let me listen to that again. Because it's just so satisfying. Also, it has some of my favorite last sentences ever. There are a couple of books that it's I have the first sentence memorized because I'm such a big fan of them, but this is one of the few books where I have the last sentence memorized because it just hits so hard. And
it packs a real punch.
honestly, as an audiobook, it really punches you in the face.
Yeah. And we say that in a good way, but nonetheless, the impact is significant. It's just so good.
You sit in the silence afterwards.
Yeah. And I'm sure I would have loved it as a book, but having that full experience, especially with the idea that you have this private detective who's interviewing individual people and talking to people and trying to piece it together, it just made it that much more tangible, even though it is fiction. So if you're into mystery and into true crime, it's a really, really, really cool listen.
Yeah.
A few ideas as to why you should listen and use Librofm, and some fabulous books to get you started if you aren't already listening to audiobooks.
And honestly, we could talk about audiobooks all day.
All day.
We have a list of over 10 or 20 books that we're maybe we'll talk about these. And
Here's some things that both us
we
and our
barely
coworkers
scratched
like.
the surface.